My name is Geraldine. I am 68 years old and my occupation is a retired emergency room head nurse. For 40 years, I worked 14-hour shifts on my feet, wiping away blood and tears, just to raise my only son, Jamal, as a single mother. I gladly skipped meals, wore my nursing shoes until the soles wore thin, and volunteered to work every Christmas and Thanksgiving, so my boy could graduate from a top-tier university completely debt-free. My son was my absolute world, the only heartbeat that kept me pushing through the hardest nights of my life. But today, after 7 long years of dead silence and forced estrangement, my world was standing on my front porch in ruins. Or rather, his wife was. Chloe was standing out there in the pouring rain, her expensive makeup running down her face as she sobbed uncontrollably. She banged her fists against my screen door, begging for my help, crying out that they were about to lose absolutely everything they owned. I did not rush to open the door. I did not offer her a warm towel or a comforting hug. Instead, I stood perfectly still in my cozy hallway, holding a hot cup of lemon tea, utterly unbothered by her dramatic performance. I stared into the eyes of the woman who had banned me from seeing my own grandchildren, treating me like a ghost for almost a decade. She pleaded that they were financially ruined, waiting for the weak, desperate mother in me to finally cave. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, looked her dead in the eye through the wire mesh, and calmly reminded her that she threw me away 7 years ago. Then, I prepared to tell her exactly what I did with the inheritance she thought she was stealing. For 40 years, the sharp smell of hospital bleach and rubbing alcohol was my constant, unforgiving companion. I worked 14-hour shifts on my feet in one of the busiest, most chaotic emergency rooms in the city, rushing from trauma bays to triage, wiping away blood, sweat, and tears, just to keep a roof over my son's head. Being a single mother is never easy, but I made a solemn vow the very day I brought Jamal home from the hospital, wrapped in a blue blanket. I swore my boy would never feel the bitter sting of poverty. I gladly skipped my own meals, eating leftover cafeteria sandwiches, so I could afford his new sneakers and advanced tutoring books. I volunteered to work every single Christmas, Thanksgiving, and New Year's Eve, trading my own holiday joy for double-time pay, so Jamal could graduate from a top-tier university completely debt-free. My son was my absolute world, the only heartbeat that kept me pushing through the hardest, most exhausting nights of my life. When he finally walked across that college graduation stage, my swollen, aching feet did not bother me one bit. I felt like the richest woman in America. So when Jamal came to me years later with a bright smile and told me he had found the woman he wanted to marry, my heart swelled with pure, unadulterated joy. Her name was Chloe. At first, she played her part flawlessly. She was sweet, respectful, and always quick to compliment me. She would bring me small bouquets of flowers, call me Mom, and sit in my kitchen acting like she hung on my every word. When it came time for them to buy their first home together, I wanted to give them the ultimate foundation for their new life. I marched right down to my bank and withdrew $60,000 from my hard-earned retirement savings for their down payment. I handed over that cashier's check with a heart full of immense pride, believing I was securing my family's legacy. I even paid for the extravagant floral arrangements at their wedding, because Chloe cried about not being able to afford her dream aesthetic. At the reception, she hugged me tightly in front of the photographer, thanking me endlessly and calling me her saving grace. But the ink on their marriage certificate was barely dry when that sweet, grateful mask completely fell off. The shift was not gradual. It was sudden and sharp, like a heavy steel door, slamming directly in my face. The warm smiles turned into tight, forced smirks. My unannounced drop-ins with fresh groceries, which she used to praise, suddenly became an irritating inconvenience. The beautiful house my retirement money secured was suddenly exclusively hers, and my presence was clearly no longer welcome. Things escalated from icy coldness to outright hostility when Chloe's brother Brad entered the picture. Brad was a 40-year-old white man who had never held down a steady job in his entire life, yet he walked around with the unearned, arrogant confidence of a billionaire. He practically moved his bags right into the guest room of the house my money paid for, treating the pristine home like his own personal frat house. He left his dirty shoes on the furniture, blasted the television at all hours, and walked past me in the hallway with zero respect, treating me like I was entirely invisible. He even took over the garage, turning it into his personal lounge, entirely funded by Jamal's hard-earned paycheck. But the real, agonizing sting came from the blatant disrespect both Chloe and Brad showed toward me and my culture. I remember spending an entire Sunday morning cooking a massive soul food dinner, making my famous collard greens, baked macaroni and cheese, candied yams, and smothered chicken, just trying to bring the family together the way I was raised. I brought the steaming dishes over, hoping to share a piece of my heart and our heritage. Brad walked into the kitchen, wrinkled his nose in disgust, and made a snide, insulting comment about how the food smelled too heavy and greasy for his liking. He loudly complained that he did not understand how people could eat such unhealthy garbage. Chloe chimed right in, laughing and agreeing with him, adding that they preferred a much cleaner, refined palate now. They complained that my voice was too loud when I laughed with my son, making passive-aggressive remarks about how I took up too much space and energy in the room. I noticed they had even taken down the beautiful black art pieces I had gifted them for their housewarming, replacing them with generic, soulless modern prints. Slowly, they started treating me like the hired help in a home I literally financed. Chloe would finish her meal, leave her dirty plate on the table, and ask me to clear the dishes, while she and Brad sat back on the patio, drinking expensive wine. And where was my son during all this blatant disrespect? Jamal just sat there, blinded by love and utterly terrified of conflict. Whenever they insulted me, he would suddenly find his plate fascinating, slicing his food in complete silence. When I pulled him aside privately to talk about how deeply they were hurting me, he would look down at his shoes, refuse to meet my eyes, and beg me to just be the bigger person. He would say that Chloe was just stressed or had a different background, asking me to keep the peace and not make a scene. It broke my heart into a million pieces to see the strong, educated man I raised shrink himself down to absolutely nothing, just to appease a woman who had zero respect for the mother who built him. The absolute breaking point. The catastrophic moment that shattered our family into unrecognizable pieces happened exactly 7 years ago. My sweet grandson Trey was just 5 years old at the time. I was visiting the house for a brief, incredibly tense afternoon when Trey suddenly fell violently ill. He had caught a nasty virus and was running a dangerously high fever of 104 degrees. He was shivering uncontrollably, his skin burning to the touch, and he looked incredibly frail and lethargic. Chloe was completely losing her mind, panicking and screaming, utterly clueless about what to do. She paced around the living room crying, doing absolutely nothing to actually help the sick child. As a retired emergency room head nurse, with 4 decades of pediatric and trauma experience, my training immediately kicked in. I did not panic. I stepped in and calmly took charge, doing exactly what I had done 1,000 times before for total strangers. I carried Trey to the bathroom, drew a tepid bath to bring his core temperature down safely and gradually, and prepared the correct balance of pediatric electrolytes to keep his little body hydrated. Within 30 minutes, I had stabilized my grandson. His fever broke, his breathing returned to normal, and he fell into a peaceful, comfortable sleep in his bed. I expected a sigh of relief. I expected a simple thank you. Instead, the moment Trey was safe, Chloe flipped a switch and turned on me with a vicious, terrifying rage. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, fabricating a hysterical, malicious lie. She accused me of overstepping my boundaries and intentionally endangering her child. She pointed her finger in my face, claiming my old school, outdated methods were harmful, and that I had absolutely no right to lay a hand on her son without her explicit medical permission. She worked herself into a frenzy, putting on the performance of a lifetime, crying and shaking violently, just as Jamal rushed through the front door from work. She ran into his arms, sobbing that I had tried to hurt their baby, and that I was a crazy, controlling monster trying to take over her role as a mother. Then she looked at my son, her eyes cold and calculating, and delivered the ultimate ultimatum. She pointed at the front door and screamed that it was either her or me, demanding that Jamal choose right then and there. I looked at my son, my heart pounding in my chest, fully expecting him to defend me. I expected him to remind his wife that I had literally saved lives for a living and had just rescued his child from a dangerous febrile seizure. Instead, Jamal looked at me with tears in his eyes. His shoulders slumped in total defeat. He did not say a single word in my defense. He weakly chose his wife. He asked me to leave. Chloe officially banned me from their house right then and there, telling me to get out and never come back. I walked out into the cold evening air, leaving behind the house my life savings had bought, leaving behind the son I had given my very soul to raise. For 7 long years, I was completely erased from my own legacy. I spent 7 years missing Trey's birthdays, spending every Thanksgiving and Christmas staring at the silent walls of my living room, setting an extra plate at the table, just in case my son ever found his courage and came back to me. He never did. I bought Christmas gifts for Trey every year, wrapping them meticulously and storing them in a guest room closet that slowly turned into a shrine of my profound grief. I was not even allowed to be present for the birth of my granddaughter Deja. I only found out my beautiful granddaughter had been born through a passing comment from an old neighbor at the grocery store. They locked me out of my family, discarded me like absolute trash, and left me to age in complete agonizing isolation, all while they lived comfortably under a roof built entirely on my lifelong sacrifices. I refused to let that terrible day break me. A lesser woman might have crumbled under the weight of such profound rejection, sinking into a deep depression and letting the years wash over her like a gentle fading tide. But I am a black woman who survived 40 years in a city emergency room. I know exactly how to stop the bleeding. I know how to triage a crisis. So instead of letting my overwhelming grief swallow me whole, I took all that agonizing pain, all that rejection, and I channeled it into a cold, calculated focus. I realized that crying alone on my couch was not going to protect my son or my grandchildren in the long run. Chloe and Brad were reckless, arrogant people, and I knew deep in my bones that one day their destructive behavior would inevitably catch up to them. I needed to be ready when that day finally came. I took the remainder of my retirement savings and I educated myself. I spent every waking hour reading financial journals, attending real estate seminars, and learning the intricate details of wealth management. I started small, buying a rundown duplex across town. I poured my sweat into renovating it, sold it for a significant profit, and used that money to buy 2 more properties. My hands, which had spent decades inserting intravenous lines and dressing severe wounds, were now signing deeds and managing construction contractors. Over those 7 years of dead silence from my son, I quietly and methodically flipped properties until I had amassed a small fortune. I took that money and set up a massive, ironclad, completely untraceable trust fund. I legally structured it so that it was meant exclusively for Jamal Trey and my sweet granddaughter Deja. I made absolutely sure that Chloe could never touch a single dime of it, shielding the funds behind complex layers of corporate protections and airtight legal clauses. The silence of my empty house was a constant, heavy reminder of what I had lost. But the growing numbers in that trust fund were a constant reminder of what I was preparing to save. Every dollar I made was a brick in the fortress I was building for my family. While I was building this empire in the shadows, I maintained my dignified silence. I never once called their house to beg or plead for access to my family. I never caused a public scene, but I was always watching. I became a quiet ghost in their lives. I created an anonymous social media account just to look at pictures of my grandchildren. I watched Trey grow into a tall, handsome young man through the distant, cold lens of a computer screen. I saw pictures of Deja, the beautiful granddaughter I had never even been allowed to hold, celebrating her birthdays with people who did not love her half as much as I did. Sometimes I would drive my car and park 3 blocks away from their elementary school, sitting quietly behind the steering wheel, just to catch a tiny glimpse of them walking out the double doors with their backpacks. I would sit there, tears streaming down my face, praying over them from a distance. I kept my distance because I knew that engaging with Chloe would only bring more chaos and hostility into their young lives. I bided my time, building a fortress of financial security for the very family that had locked me out in the cold. I knew a massive storm was coming. I just did not know how devastating it would be until the phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. The catalyst that shattered my quiet exile arrived abruptly and without any warning. I was standing in my kitchen when my cell phone vibrated on the counter. I saw the caller identification and felt an immediate, terrifying knot twist tight in the center of my stomach. It was Sheila, the current charge nurse, at the exact same hospital where I had dedicated 40 years of my life. Sheila and I had worked side by side in the chaotic trenches of the emergency room for 2 decades, and she knew everything about my painful family situation. I answered the phone, and her voice was a frantic, hushed whisper. She told me that Jamal had just been rushed through the ambulance bay doors. He had suffered a massive, catastrophic stroke while at his office and was completely unresponsive. He was currently on a ventilator in the intensive care unit, fighting for his very life. I felt the air leave my lungs. I asked her why nobody had called me, why Chloe had not informed the hospital to contact his mother. Sheila paused, her voice breaking with disgust, and told me that Chloe explicitly instructed the hospital staff not to notify me under any circumstances. Chloe had actually written on the admission forms that Jamal had no living relatives other than her. The absolute audacity of that woman made my blood run ice cold. She was actively trying to erase my existence while my only child was laying in a hospital bed clinging to life. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed my purse, got into my car, and drove to the hospital with a terrifying, singular focus. When I walked through those sliding glass doors, the familiar sharp scent of hospital-grade bleach, rubbing alcohol and sterile linens hit me instantly. This was my territory. I knew every hallway, every hidden stairwell, and every protocol in that building. I did not bother stopping at the visitor desk because I did not need a guest pass in a hospital where my name was practically engraved in the foundation. I took the service elevator straight up to the intensive care unit. When I reached the floor, the nurses on duty, many of whom I had trained myself, saw me and immediately stepped aside with quiet nods of deep respect. They pointed me toward room 4. I approached the heavy glass door and stopped. Looking through the blinds, I saw my strong, brilliant son lying in the hospital bed, pale and motionless, connected to a labyrinth of tubes and monitors, rhythmically tracking his fragile heartbeat. The sight of him so vulnerable and broken nearly brought me to my knees. The urge to run into that room and hold his hand was overwhelming, a primal maternal instinct screaming inside my chest. But before I could push the door open, I heard the sharp, unmistakable clicking of Chloe's expensive heels echoing down the hallway, accompanied by the heavy, lazy footsteps of her brother Brad. My instincts told me to confront them right then and there, to demand answers and unleash the fury of a mother scorned. But decades in the emergency room taught me that information is far more valuable than immediate confrontation. I quickly stepped backward, slipping quietly into the dark, unoccupied family consultation alcove right next door to Jamal's room. I left the door cracked just a fraction of an inch, blending completely into the shadows. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, as Chloe and Brad stopped right outside Jamal's door. They did not go inside to comfort him. They did not cry over his comatose body. Instead, they stood in the hallway, looking through the glass with expressions of cold, calculating irritation. My hands curled into tight fists by my sides as I listened to the people who had banished me from my son's life casually discuss his existence like a line item on a budget spreadsheet. Every protective barrier I had built over the last 7 years melted away, replaced by an inferno of maternal rage that demanded absolute justice. I pressed my ear closer to the crack in the door, determined to catch every single venomous syllable leaving their mouths. What I heard in that dimly lit hospital corridor was so purely evil, so completely devoid of basic human decency, that it shook me to the very core of my soul. Through the narrow gap in the doorway, I watched Brad lean against the wall, casually scrolling through his mobile phone as if he were waiting for a table at a restaurant. He looked at his sister and callously asked how long the doctors thought Jamal was going to be hooked up to those machines. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest and let out a long, frustrated sigh. She coldly replied that the neurologist said it could be weeks or even months before Jamal showed any significant signs of brain activity. Brad scoffed loudly, rubbing the back of his neck, and muttered that they absolutely did not have that kind of time. He told Chloe they needed to find a way to pull the plug as soon as legally possible, because they were completely out of cash. My heart stopped beating. I pressed my hand hard against my mouth to keep from crying out. They were actively discussing ending my son's life just to save themselves from a financial crisis. Chloe nodded in agreement, her voice trembling not with sorrow, but with sheer panic. She frantically whispered that the bank was already sending foreclosure notices, and that the second mortgage they took out using forged documents was currently in default. As they continued to bicker in the hallway, the entire horrifying truth spilled from their lips. Over the past 7 years, while they were keeping me completely isolated from my family, Chloe and Brad had systematically and ruthlessly drained every single one of Jamal's bank accounts. Chloe had secretly siphoned his income to fund her lavish designer lifestyle, completely deceiving my son about their financial reality. Brad admitted out loud that the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had pressured Chloe into stealing from Jamal's retirement funds were entirely gone, completely blown on a series of disastrous cryptocurrency ventures and risky day trades that failed spectacularly. They were entirely broke, buried under a massive mountain of hidden debt and fraudulent loans. But the absolute darkest part of their wicked conspiracy was yet to come. Brad lowered his voice, looking around the hallway nervously, and asked Chloe about the life insurance. Chloe smirked, a cruel, greedy expression spreading across her face. She whispered that she had been digging through Jamal's home office safe and found paperwork indicating he had a $1.5 million life insurance policy, along with a hidden trust fund. She told Brad that as soon as Jamal flatlined, she would automatically inherit the entire payout as his primary beneficiary. Brad laughed, asking what she planned to do with Trey and Deja once the money cleared into her account. Chloe shrugged her shoulders with an icy, terrifying detachment. She said children were way too expensive and would only slow them down. She casually revealed her master plan to take the millions, quietly surrender my precious grandchildren to the state foster care system, and immediately flee with Brad to a non-extradition country before the banks or the federal authorities could uncover the massive extent of their wire fraud. I stood in the dark, my fingernails digging so deeply into my palms that they drew blood. My overwhelming, agonizing grief instantly evaporated. The tears that had been welling in my eyes dried up entirely, replaced by a terrifying, ice-cold fury. They had financially ruined my son. They were plotting to prematurely end his life for an insurance payout. And they were actively planning to abandon my innocent grandchildren to the foster care system just to save their own worthless hides. I did not burst out of that room. I did not scream or cause a public spectacle that would allow them to paint me as an unhinged, emotional woman. I turned around and walked silently down the hospital stairwell, my mind racing with a lethal, razor-sharp clarity. The moment I got into my car, I made 2 phone calls. First, I hired the most relentless, thorough private investigator in the city to track every single digital footprint bank transfer and forged signature Chloe and Brad had ever made. Second, I called Mr. Davenport, a highly aggressive, brilliantly tactical lawyer who specialized in catastrophic financial fraud and elder abuse. I told Mr. Davenport to prepare for an absolute war. I instructed him to gather airtight, undeniable proof of their embezzlement, wire fraud, and spousal abuse. They thought they had outsmarted a foolish old nurse, but they had severely miscalculated. They had no idea that the trust fund they were desperately hunting for was created and controlled entirely by me. They had awoken a protective rage they could not possibly comprehend, and I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. The rain was coming down in heavy grey sheets, thrashing against the porch light, and soaking the wooden steps I had meticulously painted just a month prior. Standing on the other side of my screen door was the very last person I ever expected to see. Chloe was shivering violently, her expensive blonde highlights plastered to her cheeks, her designer mascara running down her face in thick black streams. She looked utterly pathetic, a far cry from the arrogant woman who had banished me from my own family 7 years ago. I stood in the quiet warmth of my hallway, holding a steaming cup of lemon tea, my face a mask of complete indifference. "Geraldine, please? You have to let me in." Chloe sobbed, her hands gripping the wire mesh of the door. "I know it has been a long time, but we are in trouble. We are about to lose everything. Jamal needs you. The kids need you." I did not move a single muscle. I did not unlock the door. I just stared at her, letting the cold silence stretch out between us, broken only by the sound of the thunder. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, weeping and gasping for air. But I had spent 40 years working in a city emergency room. I knew the difference between real panic and a calculated manipulation. "Jamal is just feeling a little sick," she continued, her voice pitching higher as she tried to force out more tears. "He had a mild stress episode from work. He is resting at a private clinic right now, and he cannot work. We are drowning Geraldine. The bank is threatening to take the house. I do not have anyone else to turn to." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her lies almost made me laugh out loud. A mild stress episode, a private clinic. I had literally stood outside the intensive care unit less than 24 hours ago. I had seen my only son, the boy I sacrificed my youth and my body to raise, lying in a coma on life support. I had heard her and her brother Brad casually discussing pulling the plug on him in the hospital corridor. Yet here she was, standing on my porch, trying to spin a fairy tale about a minor work-related stress issue. She reached into her oversized designer handbag and pulled out a thick, waterproof folder. Her hands were shaking as she held it up to the screen. "I just need your help with the kids," she pleaded. "I brought these temporary guardianship papers. If you sign them, you can help me manage Trey and Deja while Jamal rests. It also includes a standard financial assistance form, so you can authorize the bank to release some of your retirement funds to cover our mortgage. If you do not sign this tonight, your grandchildren are going to be out on the street. You do not want Trey and Deja to be homeless, do you?" She was using my precious grandchildren as emotional leverage, dangling their well-being in front of me like bait. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She still thought I was the exact same woman she kicked out 7 years ago. She thought I was just an exhausted, retired nurse who knew nothing about the world beyond medicine. She had no idea that I had spent the last 7 years completely immersing myself in financial literacy, real estate law, and wealth management. Even through the dim porch light and the rain-stained plastic sleeve of the folder, my eyes caught the bold legal jargon printed at the top of her documents. It was not a temporary guardianship form. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable transfer of assets. It was a legal maneuver designed to grant her full, unrestricted access to my entire estate, my retirement accounts, and the massive secret trust fund she somehow found out about. My blood boiled, a fierce, protective rage searing through my chest. But I knew I could not let her see my anger. If I confronted her now, she would run, and she might find another way to destroy my son before I could legally stop her. I had to play her game. I had to let her believe she was the smartest person in the room. I took a slow, trembling breath, intentionally letting my shoulders sag. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I reached out and unlocked the screen door, pushing it open just a few inches. I widened my eyes, putting on the absolute best performance of my life, morphing into the terrified, confused, heartbroken grandmother she desperately wanted me to be. "Oh my goodness, Chloe, my grandbabies," I stammered, making my voice sound weak and breathless. "I cannot let them suffer. I do not want them out on the street." "But Chloe, I do not understand any of this legal paperwork. You know I am not good with contracts." Chloe let out a breath of relief, her fake tears miraculously drying up in an instant. She pushed the folder closer to me. "It is simple. Geraldine, just sign on the dotted lines and I will take care of the rest. I promise." I shook my head slowly, looking down at my slippers. "I cannot just sign this here in the dark. My accounts are locked up tight. I have a lawyer, a Mr. Davenport. He handles my little retirement pension and all my banking. The bank will not release a single dollar without his direct authorization. Meet me at his office downtown tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Bring these papers. I will tell him to transfer whatever funds you need to keep my grandbabies safe." The transformation in Chloe's face was genuinely terrifying. The weeping, desperate daughter-in-law vanished completely. A glimmer of sheer, unfiltered greed flashed in her eyes, followed by a tight, victorious smirk. She actually believed she had won. She thought she had successfully scammed a grieving, naive old woman out of her life savings. She quickly wiped the running makeup from her cheeks, nodded eagerly, and stuffed the folder back into her expensive bag. "Thank you, Geraldine," she said, her voice completely devoid of any real emotion now. 9 o'clock. Do not be late." She turned around and practically skipped down the wet wooden steps, her heels splashing through the puddles as she jogged back to her luxury vehicle. She did not look back once. I stood in the doorway and watched her tail lights fade into the rainy night. The moment her car disappeared around the corner, I closed the heavy wooden door and locked the deadbolt. I walked straight into my kitchen, poured my tea down the drain, and picked up my cell phone. My hands were no longer shaking. My posture was perfectly straight. I dialed the number for Mr. Davenport. He answered on the second ring. I told him the prey took the bait and that they would be at his office first thing in the morning. I instructed him to prepare the boardroom, finalize the property deeds, and have the authorities on standby. We spent the next 3 hours on the phone, reviewing every single piece of evidence my private investigator had gathered, making sure every trap was set flawlessly. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in the darkness of my living room, surrounded by the absolute silence of a house that should have been filled with the laughter of my grandchildren. I thought about Jamal lying in that cold, sterile, intensive care unit. I thought about the 7 long years of missed birthdays, the unopened Christmas gifts sitting in my closet, and the heavy, suffocating pain of being erased from my own bloodline. I had spent years crying over their cruelty, but there were no tears left in me now. There was only a righteous, unbreakable determination to protect my family and utterly destroy the parasites trying to feed off my son. I went to my home office and packed a heavy leather briefcase with every bank statement, forged document, and investigative report I possessed. I was going to war, and I was taking no prisoners. The morning sun broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a bright, cold light over the city. The climate inside Mr. Davenport's law office was freezing exactly how I wanted it. The boardroom was spectacular, featuring a massive, polished mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling downtown district. I sat dead center at the head of the table. I wore my sharpest, most professional navy blue suit, my hair perfectly styled, my posture straight as a steel rod. I did not look like a frail, confused grandmother. I looked like a woman who owned the building. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Chloe strutted into the room, her hair freshly blown out, wearing a sharp designer outfit that screamed new money. She was not alone. Brad trailed right behind her, chewing loudly on a piece of gum, and wearing an expensive tracksuit paid for entirely by my son's sweat and blood. Brad took one look at me and smirked, tossing his luxury car keys onto the polished mahogany table with a loud clatter. "Let us get this over with, old lady," Brad sneered, pulling out a leather chair and slumping into it with an arrogant thud. "We have places to be this morning. Just sign the checks and we will be out of your hair." Chloe gave a fake, condescending little laugh and patted her brother on the arm. "Now, Brad, be nice to Geraldine. She is helping us out." She slid the waterproof folder across the table toward me. "Here are the guardianship and transfer forms, Geraldine. Mr. Davenport just needs to witness your signature and release the funds to my account. Mr. Davenport." A tall, imposing man in a pristine grey suit stood quietly by the door. I gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped backward, grabbed the heavy brass handles of the boardroom doors, and pulled them shut. A second later, the distinct, loud, heavy click of the deadbolt locking into place echoed through the silent room. Chloe frowned, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in sudden confusion. "Why did he lock the door?" she asked, her voice losing a fraction of its arrogant confidence. I did not answer her immediately. I kept my eyes locked onto hers as I reached down to the floor and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I placed it on the table, undid the metal clasps, and pulled out a massive 4-inch thick binder. I lifted the binder and slammed it down onto the mahogany table. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Brad jumped in his seat, the gum suddenly stopping in his mouth. I looked at Chloe, dropping the frail grandmother act completely. My voice was low, steady, and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "You came to my house last night in the pouring rain. You stood on my porch and told me my son was suffering from a little stress. You told me he was resting at a private clinic. You lied straight to my face." Chloe turned pale, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to formulate a response. "I was at the hospital yesterday." I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls. I stood outside room 4 in the intensive care unit. I saw my son on life support, and I heard every single word you and your brother said in that hallway. I heard you plotting to pull the plug on him because you ran out of money. Brad stood up aggressively, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You listen to me, you crazy old bat!" he shouted, pointing a finger at me. "You cannot prove a damn thing. We own our house. We are in control of the finances. You are just a bitter old woman who has not been around for 7 years." I let out a cold, sharp, utterly humorless laugh. I opened the massive binder and slid the first stack of papers across the long table. "You thought you were draining a bottomless well," I said, watching Chloe's eyes dart to the documents. "These are the bank statements from the accounts you completely depleted. These are the fraudulent wire transfers you made to cover Brad's failed cryptocurrency scams. These are the forged signatures you used to take out a second and third mortgage on the house I paid for. Chloe stumbled backward, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she stared at the undeniable proof of her federal crimes. "You cannot do this," she stammered, her voice shaking with genuine terror now. "We still own the house. I am his wife. I have rights." "Actually, Chloe, you do not own a damn thing," I said smoothly. I signaled to Mr. Davenport, who walked forward and slid a pristine legal document directly in front of her shaking hands. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "When you stopped paying that second mortgage to fund your luxury lifestyle, the bank moved to foreclose on the property. I hired a private investment firm to purchase your defaulted debt. I own the note on your house. I am the bank. I am your landlord. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, you and your brother are officially evicted." Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream of pure frustration. She slammed her hands on the table, her face contorted with rage. "You cannot do this to me. I am Jamal's wife. I have his medical and financial power of attorney. I make the decisions about his health and his money. You have absolutely no power here." I smiled, a slow, deeply satisfying smile that I had waited 7 agonizing years to show her. "You really should have read the fine print before you married my son, Chloe." I pulled out the final, most crucial document from the back of my binder and held it up for her to see. 7.5 years ago, long before you ever managed to isolate him completely from me. Jamal and I sat down with Mr. Davenport. Jamal signed a comprehensive, ironclad medical and financial directive. In the event of his severe incapacitation, full authority over his health, his businesses, and every single cent of his assets defaults exclusively to me, his mother. Your forged paperwork is entirely worthless. You have absolutely nothing. Brad's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. The arrogant smirk he had worn since the day he moved into my son's house completely vanished, replaced by the cornered panic of a man who realized his free ride had just violently crashed. He slammed his fists down on the mahogany table so hard the wood rattled his chair, screeching backward against the floor as he lunged toward me. He raised his hand, shouting that I was nothing but a manipulative, bitter old woman, and that he was not going to let me ruin his life. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring a hole straight through him. Before Brad could take another step in my direction, Mr. Davenport stepped smoothly between us. He did not raise his voice. He did not break a sweat. He simply straightened his immaculate suit jacket, looked at Brad with absolute disgust, and informed him that any sudden movements would be highly ill-advised. Mr. Davenport calmly reached into his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and placed it on the table. He announced that he had already forwarded the entire 4-inch binder of financial records, forged signatures, and fraudulent wire transfers directly to the district attorney's office. Then, with a chillingly polite smile, Mr. Davenport revealed that there were currently 4 uniformed police officers waiting patiently in the lobby downstairs, completely briefed and ready to act. The color drained from Brad's face. He froze mid-step, the angry red flush of his skin turning a sickly pale white. Chloe let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as the heavy boardroom doors swung open. The officers walked in, their expressions stern and uncompromising. They moved with swift, practiced precision, entirely ignoring Brad's sudden, pathetic attempts to explain that it was all a massive misunderstanding. The lead officer read them their rights, stating they were being placed under arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, forgery, and severe spousal and elder financial abuse. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs, snapping shut around Brad's wrists, was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 7 long years. Chloe, absolutely shattered. The fake, calculated weeping she had tried to use on my porch the night before was completely gone, replaced by ugly, desperate, chest-heaving sobs. Real tears streamed down her face as the officers pulled her arms behind her back, She dropped to her knees right there on the boardroom carpet, looking up at me with wild, terrified eyes. She begged me to call them off. She screamed my name, pleading that she was the mother of my grandchildren, that she made a terrible mistake, and that we could fix this together as a family. She promised she would never keep the kids from me again if I just dropped the charges. I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing the front of my navy blue suit. I walked around the long table, looking down at the woman who had intentionally broken my son's heart and tried to erase my very existence. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice perfectly steady and ice cold. You banned me for 7 years, Chloe. Consider yourself banned for a lifetime. I turned my back on her screams and walked out of the room. By 3 o'clock that exact same afternoon, Mr. Davenport and I were standing in front of a family court judge with an emergency petition. With the overwhelming mountain of evidence proving Chloe and Brad were actively plotting to abandon the children and flee the state, the judge did not hesitate for a single second. I was immediately granted full emergency physical and legal custody of Trey and Deja. When the social workers brought them to my home later that evening, my heart nearly burst out of my chest. Trey was so tall now, carrying the same gentle eyes his father had at 12 years old, and little Deja was a spitting image of my own mother. They stood in my hallway, nervous and confused, having been fed terrible lies about me for their entire lives. I did not push them. I simply led them upstairs to the guest room I had kept closed for 7 years. I opened the door and showed them the towering stacks of neatly wrapped birthday and Christmas presents, with their names written lovingly on the tags. I showed them the photo albums I had kept updated with pictures I printed from the internet. When Trey saw that I had never forgotten a single milestone, he broke down and threw his arms around my neck. Deja quickly followed, burying her face in my shoulder. In that beautiful, tear-filled embrace, my grandchildren finally realized their grandmother had never stopped loving them. The healing process was slow, but we navigated it together. 3 agonizing weeks later, the call I had been praying for every single night finally came. The hospital informed me that the swelling in Jamal's brain had subsided, and he was slowly waking up from his coma. I rushed to the intensive care unit and sat directly beside his bed, holding his large hand in mine. When he finally fluttered his eyes open and focused on my face, the first tear slipped down his cheek. Over the next few days, as his strength returned, I had to sit him down and explain the horrible, devastating truth about the woman he had chosen. I showed him the forged documents, the empty bank statements, and the police reports. I watched my strong son break down, realizing the catastrophic depth of his wife's betrayal and the immense danger his children had been in. But more importantly, he realized that the mother he had turned his back on was the exact same mother who swooped in to save his life, protect his children, and secure his entire legacy. He held my hands, weeping with profound remorse, asking for a forgiveness I had already granted him the moment he was born. When Jamal was finally cleared to leave the hospital and begin his physical rehabilitation, I made the final, most satisfying executive decision of my life. I officially sold the house that Chloe and Brad had thoroughly tainted, liquidating the property entirely. I took those funds, combined them with the massive trust I had built in the shadows, and purchased a breathtaking, sprawling new estate situated on 5 acres of beautiful land. It has a massive kitchen for my Sunday soul food dinners, a beautiful suite for Jamal to recover in peace, and an enormous backyard for Trey and Deja to run free. I brought my son and my grandchildren home, locking the gates behind us to keep the world out. I officially reclaimed my family, and this time, nobody will ever have the power to take them away from me again. Looking back on this long journey, I have learned a harsh but necessary truth about motherhood and boundaries. We pour our souls into our children, gladly sacrificing our youth and our comfort to pave the way for their success. But we must never lose ourselves in the process. A mother's love is a bottomless well, but it ain't a fool's fountain. We are not endless resources to be drained by ungrateful people. I had to learn the hard way that blood makes you related, but respect and loyalty make you family. True family protects you, honors your sacrifices, and stands by you when storms come. Never let anyone, not even the people you gave birth to, make you feel like a guest in your own life. Your dignity is your crown, and you must never take it off for anyone. Stand tall, protect your heart, and guard your peace fiercely. Now I turn the floor over to all the strong, resilient women listening to my voice right now. If you felt the fire in my story today, and if you believe that nobody messes with a grandmother's legacy, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Sharing these stories helps us build a powerful community of women who absolutely refuse to be silenced or manipulated. I want to hear from you, beautiful queens, in the comments. Where are you watching this? From what time is it there? And what would you have done if it were your grandbabies? Would you have fought as hard as I did to protect your bloodline? Let's talk about it. I read every single message, and your wonderful support keeps me sharing my truth. Thank you so much for walking this long road with me today. Until next time, stay blessed and stay sharp.